basically we have to look at two different kinds of impact of the world crisis on the Indian economy. One is the directly financial impact. India did not have much of a financial impact because in India we had much of our banking sector was nationalized. The nationalized banking sector, at the time of the crisis, the total amount of foreign assets held by the Indian banks was about 7% proportion. Of the total assets they had, about 7% consisted of foreign assets. Now, all foreign assets are not toxic assets. Okay, so the proportion of toxic assets was even smaller, and even this 7% was not so much in the nationalized, the big banks, but some of the other banks, smaller banks. ICICI, for instance, had a fair amount of foreign assets and so on. Those were the banks in whose case vulnerability was at all being talked about. But the bulk of the Indian banking system, particularly the big nationalized banks, State Bank and so on, they hardly had any foreign assets. They didn't have much. As a result, it was, India could absorb that financial shock very easily. Okay. But of course, so the financial system did not impact on India as much. Let me just go back a little bit. We were discussing bubbles. Now, what happens in a bubble? What happens in a bubble, let us say, is that suppose the price of the financial asset is high. I want to buy a financial asset. I want to buy it in order to sell tomorrow. Suppose the financial asset is 100 rupees, and so I can go to a bank and then borrow a certain part, either the 100 rupees or a proportion of it, from the bank, and the bank will willingly give me a loan and I buy the financial asset. When the bubble collapses, think of the bank, because as far as the bank is concerned, the amount it had given to me now has virtually zero value. So the bank becomes vulnerable because its assets go down drastically while its liabilities remain what they were. That's the cause of the financial crisis, namely the collapse of the bubble immediately affects the entire financial system, because the entire financial system was complicit in building up these assets whose value now collapses relative to their liabilities. Okay. Now in India, because there was very little foreign asset holding, very little of these asset values collapsed, consequently there was no problem at all. Okay. But on the other hand, the real crisis, because when this happens, I mentioned that a bubble increases aggregate demand. The collapse of a bubble also reduces aggregate demand. Naturally, when people are bankrupt, they cut back on their consumption. When no investment takes place, etc. Therefore, there's a fall in the aggregate demand, unemployment, world economy, generally gets into a recession, etc. All that is affecting the Indian economy. For 10 consecutive months in India now, exports have been going down in value, in absolute terms, last 10 months. And that's affecting China as well. China immediately withstood this world capitalist crisis quite dramatically, quite successfully, because financially it was not much exposed. And in terms of real sectors, Chinese exports did not suffer as much because China was a low-cost producer. And as I mentioned, the domestic property boom kept up the Chinese GDP growth rate. And of course, they also had a fairly significant fiscal stimulus. Okay, but now the fiscal stimulus is not being increased any further. Property boom has collapses, and the world market recession is beginning to affect them. So China's growth rate is falling. Exactly the same is holding as far as India is concerned. So we were the victims of the real crisis, not of the financial crisis. They are the ones whose real crisis is linked to their financial crisis. So financial crisis, real crisis, no immediate impact, but impact of the real crisis on us. That's the way it is. Okay, suppose you compare an Indian bank which does not have any finger in the foreign assets pie. These foreign assets prices are rising. Okay, so during the boom, what would appear is that these are not profit making, those are profit making. Those who are participating in the bubble become the profit-making banks because they are getting big cuts out of these bubbles and so on. But on the other hand, these people who are giving loans to kind of the usual sort of thing, they are not getting anything out of it. So that is But on the other hand, when the bubble collapses, just the opposite happens. So that is one of the reasons why this whole notion of profitability as an index of banks' performance is completely wrong, because profitability is boosted by speculative gains. Okay. By the way, there is this view about the crisis, that the crisis is because of greed. Okay. I mean, even people like Stiglitz argue. Okay, there are two views. One says the crisis is because of greed, and many others say that the crisis happened because of lack of caution. That subprime loans, that really speaking, we are giving loans which were really not to proper borrowers. I think both these are really wrong arguments, because if you say, to say the crisis, greed, I mean, in a capitalist economy, an economic agent, whether it's a businessman or a bank and so on, is supposed to make profits. That's the idea. Now, that is the modus operandi of the system. There's no greed involved in it. If somebody wants to make a profit when there's a bubble going, they would do that as long as they're allowed to. Okay. In the old days, in FD Roosevelt's time, there was this legislation that actually prevented banks from going in for speculative lending. But that legislation was done away with, though now they have brought back some controls in the Clinton years. Okay. So as long as banks are allowed to finance speculative activities, they would do so because it's more profitable. So there is nothing, greed is a moral term. Okay, it is not. It has no explanatory value, because it is just a moral condemnation of an activity, which at other times we happily say capitalism is good because they are making profits, as you know. So, all right. The other explanation, which is equally wrong, is the subprime crisis, namely that somewhere the banks were actually becoming incautious. Had they been cautious, then there would be no crisis. What this misses is that suppose they had been cautious, then you would have had huge levels of unemployment. Part of the reason why in the 1990s and the first, pre-2007-8, the level of unemployment in the US was so low, the reason why there was a real sector boom was because of the fact that you actually had all these loans being given out. Okay. So, to say that subprime, incautious lending is the cause of the crisis, misses the point that incautious lending was also the cause of the boom. Okay. And the same thing that produced a pronounced boom, namely a bubble, also produces a crisis. So you cannot simply say that, that this bit is bad, the other bit is okay, because one bit is linked to the other bit. Okay. No, you see, this is exactly my point. Yeah, this is exactly my point. How to reach a balance? You see, you cannot reach you see, to say how to reach a balance amounts to saying that we are forever going to have a high enough level of unemployment in capitalist economies. Okay. Those days, in the 1990s and in the early years of the current century, capitalist economies had very low levels of unemployment. In other words, I said earlier, golden age, but even now, because of this bubble, the unemployment rate was low, now it is high. But if you say, let's not have that in order to prevent this, then that amounts to saying that let's permanently have 8% unemployment rate. Okay, we may not have 11% as now, but we can permanently have 8% instead of 5 then and 11 now, or something of that kind. You can have both. You can have both if bubbles are not the factor generating booms. That's what happened in the golden age. That is when you had state expenditure. But on the other hand, if that is not allowed, in that case you have to have this. That's why you need politics, but that's why, to come back to the point, within the capitalist system, politics has now been shown cannot really drive economics, because economics does tend to drive politics. there's a lot of discussion, which to my mind is completely meaningless, about whether class is more important than caste. And in India there's a lot of discussion on that kind, that Marxists talk about class, but as a matter of fact caste is very important here, more important. Marxist categories therefore are inapplicable and so on. I think all that is completely irrelevant. I mean, I think what I was trying to say in the morning is that if capitalism is a spontaneous system, if capitalism is a spontaneous self-driven system, in that case, whether it is in India or in the US or wherever it is, it actually has a certain inner dynamics. All right. I think everything, whether it is caste, class, mixture of the two, however it is driven by this inner dynamics. Okay, so the relevance of Marxist categories in a country like India would arise not because class is more important than caste and so on, but would arise only to the extent that capitalism has an inner dynamics even when it is in India that actually changes things. I mean, it is the dynamic element in the picture that is changing both caste configurations, class relations and everything. So our focus should be on that rather than which is more important. If you assume them to be in the workforce, which they are, because strictly speaking they are people who need the work, then the unemployment rate is 11%. The fact that you have this very significant unemployment rate persisting despite almost 0% long-term interest rate, which means monetary policy has run its course. You can't make monetary policy into negative interest rates. Okay. Fiscal policy not possible because of the fact that you have austerity. No policy therefore is now available to get these economies out of their crisis. You just have to wait for a new bubble to arise whenever it does. But in the absence of such a bubble, you actually would find that situation might actually become worse. And this is likely to be the case also because for a while there was a property bubble in China, as I mentioned. That property bubble in China has collapsed, which is why Chinese growth rates are collapsing. With Chinese growth rates collapsing, China, now you see, so all of, because of the persistence of the crisis, different countries then start struggling against one another for a larger output, which is, as I mentioned last time, beggar my neighbor policies. Now, I think the Chinese devaluation of the yuan was one example of this beggar my neighbor policy, but on the other hand, this is something which has given rise to devaluations of other currencies, and this kind of thing is likely to continue. And if it continues, uncertainties in the world market increase, investment falls further, and therefore you would have an even worsening of the kind of crisis. So when we look at the crisis today, I mean, I just want to link it up with what I said earlier, that basically the idea that you could, through putting politics in command, get rid of some of the structural features which we had known to be associated with capitalism, which was Keynes's assumption, which is a liberal supposition, and which appeared to work for a while in the post-Second World War period for a couple of decades, is something which is not working because that was a period, in my view, an exceptional period, when capital accepted all these restrictions upon its own predilections. But now you have a situation where, once more, economics is driving politics. That means, by economics driving politics, I mean the economic tendencies, the kind of things that capital would like, the kind of economic regime that capital would like, the kind of economic regime that has typically always characterized capitalism, within which capital has functioned, that regime has re-established itself, and with its re-establishing, once more, we have now a very serious tendency towards unemployment and crisis, which basically shows, in my view, that the liberal presumption that you can actually interfere with capitalism in order to reform it has now been shown to be something which was an exaggeration, excessive optimism. The growth of the informal economy itself is a reflection of the crisis. In other words, let's say in the 1930s depression, there was large numbers of people who were unemployed. In the West itself, in Britain for instance, they started setting up for shining shoes. Okay. Now you could say that there's a tremendous boom in the shoe shine sector, but on the other hand, that's actually a reflection of the crisis. So I think a lot of what appears to be a boom, or not a boom, but a growth of the informal economy is really a symptom of the crisis, a kind of response to the crisis, rather than something which denies the crisis. The interest rate in India is much higher than the interest rate that prevails, say, in the United States or in Europe and so on. But then, I mean, the point is that if you look at global interest rates, okay, suppose capital is freely mobile, all right? Anybody who is choosing between, let's say, holding dollar-denominated assets and holding rupee-denominated assets, okay, rupee-denominated assets would be having a higher rate of return compared to dollar-denominated assets. Okay, let's just consider bank deposits. Okay, now the reason why these differences do not get eliminated is because there is a certain risk associated with holding your wealth in India. As far as, let's say, American businessmen are concerned, there's a country risk associated in India. You never know. There may be a riot, the government might fall, there may be a cyclone, there may be an earthquake. At any rate, whether it actually happens or not, that is there always in the minds of people. Stefan Edberg refused to play a tennis match in India on the grounds that I can't go to India. There are all kinds of diseases are going around. Anyway, so the point is that there is a country risk associated, and of course risk specific to assets and so on. So it has always been the case that the interest rates in an economy like India would be higher than the interest rate in the United States. If the interest rates were equal, not only is it the case that American wealth holders wouldn't bring their money to India, Indian wealth holders would take their money out. Because now Indian wealth holders say, all right, here we are getting 10%, 9%, 8%, while in America is 0%, so why take wealth out? Okay. So in fact, it is an important point, because people often talk about level playing field. You can never have a level playing field, because the interest rate in India would always be higher than the interest rate in the United States or in Eurozone countries. Okay. Investment would reduce with the high interest rate. Absolutely. That's exactly why you can't have a level playing field. Exactly. That's why you can't have. But that in an economy like India, you would be finding that capitalists would be borrowing at much higher interest rates than in the United States. Exactly. And that's why also, other things being equal, of course, the wages here are much lower, their capacity to compete in the world market would be that much greater than the capacity of the Indian manufacturers to compete in the world market. And so in areas in which labor cost is not a significant input, it would be quite difficult for manufacturers in India to compete. There was a time that Mr. Ben Bernanke, who was the earlier chairman of the Fed, put out this idea of a global savings glut. That there's too much savings in the world economy. That's completely wrong. That's just theoretically bogus. Okay, why? Okay, let me just consider an economy. Okay, suppose in an economy, everybody decides suppose everybody was saving 20% of their incomes. Everybody decides to save 40% of their incomes. What would happen in the economy? Income gets halved. Income gets halved. Because when you say that if investment remains unchanged, savings would remain unchanged. If savings remain unchanged, but everybody's saving ratio goes up as proportion of income, then income has to get halved. That's why global savings glut is bogus, because you can never have a global savings glut. Okay. In other words, it can never be the case that there's too much savings, because the amount of realized savings would always be equal to the amount of investment that is undertaken. If you take the world as a whole, the total level of savings must be exactly equal to the total level of investment. All right. Now the point is that today, therefore, so suppose today investment in the world economy picked up, which is what basically the US government wants, which is why the 0% interest rate and so on. In that case, all over the world, there would be an increase in the savings. One of the problems would be, in fact, this is related to your thing, that if saving, okay, in any country, investment being greater than savings is the same as having a current account deficit on the balance of payments. That's the national income identity. Savings being greater than investment is the same as having a current account surplus on the balance of payments. The US runs a current account deficit. Systematically, it has been doing. Therefore, the rest of the world runs a current account surplus. Therefore, the rest of the world has an amount of savings greater than the investment of the rest of the world. Okay. That is why in the US the investment is always greater than their domestic savings. In the rest of the world, the savings are greater than their domestic investment, which is why the US has a current account deficit. Poverty in India is defined in terms of how many people are there below 2,200 calories per day in rural, and 2,100 in urban. You can calculate how many people are there from the National Sample Survey data. When you look at that data, you find that unlike pre-liberalization period, when the percentage roughly was around 56, 57, it has climbed up to above 70 now. So the whole idea that poverty has gone down in the period of liberalization is an idea which simply cannot be sustained on the official definition of poverty. I'm not saying that, that okay, many things change. When you compare British India with today's India, okay, today's India, there are antibiotics available. Those days there weren't any. So there are many things happen. But simply by the official definition of poverty, to which everybody, this is the Planning Commission's definition of poverty. By that, it is very clear that the percentage of population below these calorie norms has increased in India quite significantly in the period since liberalization. Okay. This is their definition of poverty, not my definition of poverty, but the figures they give are not correct. Why is it that is not correct? I have tried to explain it that time, that the consumer price, what they do is, instead of looking at the people below these norms, they say in the base year how many people were below these norms, and which was the cutoff point in terms of expenditure where these norms were met. They call that poverty line and bring it up to date by using a consumer price index. But that consumer price index is something which is underestimated. That is why you get this decline in poverty. In America, what happened, that is quite different. In America, what happened was that large numbers of people borrowed from the banks in order to buy houses. Housing demand went up, housing construction went up, but of course credit against housing also went up. But on the other hand, this was based on a bubble, in the sense what the banks would do is to simply get these papers and then sell them off to other people. Okay, and so the banks were making a profit by they were not taking the risks, they were actually shifting the risks to all kinds of other people. Okay, so they would give huge loans but shift the risks to all kinds of other people who did not know what the risks were, whether it's going to be paid back or not, etc. Now, therefore, it was a huge credit boom in a sense, which was based on a bubble, because housing prices were going up and therefore people were getting more and more credit for the houses they were going to purchase. Now, when we are talking about India, it's not as if the banks are giving huge amount of loans to poor people wanting to buy houses. So it's a very different situation. It's not the American situation of a housing bubble. In fact, in India, nobody gives subprime loans. They only give loans as far as the upper middle class is concerned, consumer credit and so on. Agriculture is tough. There's a way of looking at the capitalist economy. Okay, is that right or wrong? Let's just look at that. Okay, in other words, let's not use the word. Marx himself was, after all, struggling to look at capitalist economy. Marx was not developing some religion called Marxism. Okay, so let's just do that. And as I was saying in the morning, that there appeared to be a period in the post-Second World War era when it appeared that in fact the liberal argument may have strength in it, because the golden age of capitalism was a product of the liberal argument. But on the other hand, increasingly, as we are now coming to 2015, it is obvious that that era is over. A whole lot of spontaneous tendencies of capitalism towards crisis, unemployment, which we had thought, I was a student then, that these are things of the past. They have reappeared in a very big way. And what is more, all over the world, partly, of course, one cannot be excessively economistic, but partly as a response to all this crisis, you are actually having tendencies toward development of fascism, tendencies towards development of racialism, you are having terrorism, you are having collapse of as it were, civilizational values all over the world. Now, I think this is a very serious crisis. In other words, this does show that the liberal argument that through social engineering you can actually bring about sufficient change in capitalism so that you can actually build a humane world order, is something which has not proved to be correct. Okay, the question is why not, and I was trying to argue why not. Call it anything you like. George Bernard Shaw wrote a play called Mrs. Warren's Profession, in which someone says, I'm in love. He says, no, don't call it love, call it chemistry. So call it anything you like. But the fundamental point is that we, in today's world, are faced with this basic debate, namely, is it possible within the confines of capitalism, through appropriate political intervention, to bring about changes in it so that a humane order can be built? Or is it the case that it is necessary to go beyond? And what I'm trying to say is that Marx said it was necessary to go beyond, and today, the way the world is moving, I believe that argument stands vindicated, and even those who don't think it stands vindicated need to engage with that argument.